Human behavior is driven by a combination of nature, our instincts based in biology, nurture, the instructions we get from our surrounding culture, and agency, our personal initiative. Much of the drama of human life stems from the tension between these three forces. Welcome back to the show. If it's your first time, welcome. We have another video / podcast around a certain book that I've read that I think requires folks to know more about. So this is why I try to do these, whether you read the book or not. It's not, I always recommend reading the book because we all have our own opinions based on like how we were nurtured. And we'll get to that in this book as well. But the book I'll be going over today for y'all is this, if you're watching on YouTube, Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves. Now, if you haven't already, I have tons of videos of books that I've read in the past around masculinity. So you can check those out. The Way of the Superior Man, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, and more to come. So I do these because I am very passionate about men's work. For personal reasons, as I grew up in a single mother household. If you're not new, you probably know that through the podcast in the past. But if you are new, that's part of my story and why I see myself so closely to a lot of the young men nowadays. And I've worked in my day job with a lot of young men and have seen it firsthand. Like not just through reading a book, because it's difficult when you just read a book and you do not see it in your day-to-day. But I have. I've seen the pains. I've seen the challenges and what's going on out there. So this was a lot. I took a lot of notes in this book. Richard Reeves does a really great job on bringing in data, and he tries to remove all biases out of the book. So he's not too left, he's not too right, because he does talk about politics in this. He talks about why both sides are wrong. And he really digs into why we have to come together on this issue. It's not a she issue, it's an all of us issue. It's a human crisis issue. And if we keep going the way we're going now, the future looks pretty grim because, we need each other. Women and men need each other. We can't just be one way. So he talks a lot about that. So we'll see more there. And I'm sorry, I got this new mic, so I'm trying to figure out to make sure that I'm not too loud for you. So I make sure not to talk too loud as well. Anyway, so we start with the preface of the book. And what I love is this first line. He says, we can hold two thoughts in our head at once. We can be passionate about women's rights and compassionate towards vulnerable boys and men. And I love that because if you see, I work in the workforce, and a lot of the push right now is getting more women into the workforce, which I think is phenomenal. And I look at the other side and see the struggles that boys and men are going through. I see how challenged they are in looking for education, or how challenged they are in getting into jobs and performing well. See, it's not about only getting into jobs. We can hold on to that data, but it's also on how these men perform in their jobs. And performance around young men right now is not looking too good. But we'll get into that. So this is where he starts kind of the political piece. The political piece is in part 3, but let's set a precedence. So here he says, progressive refuse to accept that important gender equalities can run in both directions and quickly label male problems as symptoms of toxic masculinity, in quotes. Conservatives appear more sensitive to the struggles of boys and men, but only as a justification for turning back the clock and restoring traditional gender roles. The left tells men, quote, be more like your sister. The right says, quote, be more like your father. end quote. Neither invocation is helpful. What is needed is a positive vision of masculinity that is compatible with gender equality. As a conscientious objector in the culture wars, I hope to have provided an assessment of the condition of boys and men that can attract broad support. Again, very respectful of Richard Reeves. I hope to have him on the podcast as well to discuss this more in detail, because all this data is now. I always say, when you read a book, you have to read it, especially one such as this that has a lot of data, you have to read it the year that it comes out, because data changes, things change, the world changes. So this book is timed. I can't say it's timeless versus other books that I've brought on here that are timeless. The Way of the Superior Man, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. You can always go back to those books. This one, if you try to come to this book in 5 years, either the numbers will be much worse or a little better. So highly recommend. And it's short. It took me like 3 days to read. It was not even 200 pages. So part 1, the male malaise. And this first subchapter is called Girls Rule, Boys Are Behind in Education. So he starts with this quote, not starts, but one of the quotes I noted. So we have an education system favoring girls and a labor market favoring men. Two wrongs don't make a right. We need to fix both. Inequalities matter, regardless of their direction. It is also worth noting that while women are catching up with men in the labor market, boys and men are falling further behind in the classroom. One gap is narrowing and the other is widening. Now, to further explain this, he gives a little bit of data here. Male students are more likely to stop out, quote unquote. That is, to take a detour away from their studies, and they are also more likely to drop out and fail to graduate at all. The differences are not trivial. 46% of female students enrolling in public four-year college have graduated 4 years later. For male students, the proportion is 35% and dropping. I worked in a college for a little bit when I was back in New York, and I worked for a nonprofit within the college. So didn't work for the college directly. I worked for the nonprofit and supporting the students of this college. And I definitely can see it was pretty much like a 60-40 split. 60% of women came through this program, 40% men. And out of those 40% men, the young men were more likely to drop out of the program than the women. They were more likely to drop out of the college. They were more likely to ask, do I need to go to college to do this program? So on and so forth. So just giving my own experience in this, and as a college student myself, I did drop out of my 4-year college and didn't finish my 4 years. I had enough credits to finish an associate 2-year degree. So I just took that and was like, great, I'll just use that and maybe come to school later. And that was 11 years ago that I did that. And during my college experience, I took 2 breaks. So I took 2 semesters off, not entire in total, but 2 separate years. I think one was in spring. It took me 3 years to get the credits for the 2-year because I went part-time at some point, because I had to work full-time to even buy a Metro card to afford to go to school, to go to work and these things. So it was very difficult, and we'll get into that as well. The second subchapter is called Working Man Blues. Men are losing ground in the labor market. So during the book, he interviews many economists, psychologists, doctors, scientists, and things of that nature. So you'll hear a lot of names. And one of the people is called Melissa Kearney. She's a top-notch economist. And this is the quote that I got. Whether she was more worried about, he asked her if she was more worried about men or women. And she took a moment. He sprung the question on her in front of a highly influential audience. And she said, quote, I'm really worried about the extent to which men in the U.S. are being pushed to the side of economic, social, and family life, she responded. For 20, 30, or 40 years, scholars focused on women and children. Now we really need to think about men. Because unfortunately, us as a society can't hold two thoughts at the same time. Oh, men are kicking ass in the workforce? Great, we'll just put all our focus and all our money baskets on this side of things and forget about them because they're doing well already. Yet not knowing that as you implement these things, what's happening? Men have always been in pain. Yeah, we had much more opportunities and we kind of took a lot of that by force and things like that. But on the other hand, that's because it came from a place of pain. It came from a place of darkness. So men have always needed help, but they just never asked for help. So that's my own personal opinion on this. The biggest fall in male employment has in fact been among young men aged between 25 to 34. Why is that? You may be asking, right? So, as he states here, male jobs have been hit by a 1-2 punch. Automation, free trade. Machines pose a greater threat to working men than to women for two reasons. First, the occupations most susceptible to automation are just more likely to employ men. As my colleague Mark Murrow shows, quote, men make up over 70% of production occupations, over 80% of transportation occupations, and over 90% of construction and installation occupations, he writes. And these are all occupational groups with current task loads that have above average projected automation exposure. By contrast, women make up most of the workforce in relatively automation safe occupations such as healthcare, personal services, and education. So think about that. Many, many years ago, the reason why more men were in work because of those hard jobs that you see. I recently came from a trip in Mount Shasta, California. I have a little sticker here. And what I saw is not, it's 4 hours away from where I currently live. And there's no city nearby. The closest city is this place called Redding, California, which is not a city. It's more like a big-ass suburb. But Mount Shasta is really small town. I think I walked the town in less than an hour. And what I saw there, my experience when I would go out in the morning, seeing the men doing the construction work, seeing men doing logging work. I saw logging work, so cutting down trees and doing all that. And a lot of the restaurants and places, services, you can say, were mostly women, like 80%. Every store I went into was a woman behind the counter, a woman serving me when I went out to eat the 2 times that I did. Versus all the, you can say, harder jobs or like very manual task jobs that I saw were men. And this is, I'm sure, very common across any relatively small town where I respect a lot of that work because everything we use, the standing table that I'm using, that's wood, all of this is built probably, like the wood comes from somebody. And probably a man that did that job. And those are hard, very difficult jobs. So he talks about this, so the STEM piece, which is probably the biggest question. Like, we need to get more women in STEM. We need to get more women in STEM. So he says, there has been a commendable and largely successful push to get more girls and women into jobs that require STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math skills. But it is now even more important to encourage men into what I call HEAL, health, education, administration, and literacy jobs, which are dominated by women. Now, that has not grown. And I think I'm going to go over it, but let's keep checking the quotes here. So you got that. The pay gap, which is a big conversation I see constantly, especially like on LinkedIn and things like that. And just a quick caveat before I even go here is that when I'm, I work in my day job talking to a lot of people, I see pay all the time. I see what people are getting paid all the time because I work in the HR area. And yes, I do notice that when I talk to women, they usually ask for much less compensation-wise than men. I noticed that. Like, men are more likely to ask for a few $1,000s more than women when I ask, what are you looking to get paid for something like this, right? But as an organization, at least the organization I work for, we don't pay anyone less just because of a gender difference, for sure. I've seen, no, we're going to pay that person what they're worth as a human being, to make sure they can live a decent life. Anyway, so again, I'm coming from a place of seeing this, having experience firsthand, which a lot of people don't, that you see on the internet, right? They just read things online and think that's the absolute truth. But the absolute truth is weird. And I've talked about that on the podcast before, that the truth always lies somewhere in the middle. Like, there's two extreme answers. It's just like, I need to really do my due diligence, but usually it lies in the middle. So anyway, let's go here. The pay gap accurately describes the difference in the economic resources available to individual men and women in the middle of their respective wage distributions. It is not a myth. It is math. The real disagreements is not over whether the typical woman earns less than the typical man, but why? Conservatives point to studies showing that once a range of factors influencing pay are taken into account, hours, industry, experience, seniority, location, and so on, the pay gap almost evaporates. Various studies of this kind put the adjusted gender pay gap at around 5%. In a foreword to a 2009 study commissioned by the federal government, Deputy Assistant Labor Secretary Charles James concluded that, quote, the raw wage gap should not be used as the basis to justify corrective actions. Indeed, there may be nothing to correct. There is certainly very little evidence that women are paid less than men for doing the same work in the same way. Women are paid less because they do different work, or work differently, or both. But of course, that is not the end of the story. Women may earn less because they occupy fewer senior positions, but that fact itself may be the result of institutional sexism. Similarly, it is true that women tend to be more clustered than men in lower paying occupations and industries, which explains perhaps a third of the pay gap. But that may reflect socialized gender roles, not least in terms of family responsibilities or devaluation of work that is done by women or both. In any case, while there is a pay gap between occupations, there is as big a gender pay gap within occupations. So you have to look at the broad. You have to look at everything. And I always say, when someone talks about a study, you need to reference that study. Where does it come from? Because there's a such thing as bad studies. I always use the example of nutrition and how bad the studies were when low fat was all the craze. And that didn't help a lot of people. And if anything, it made matters worse. And we're experiencing that right now. Taking away lard and things we used to use to cook, oils we used to use, heart sickness, heart disease was not as prevalent as it is now. That could be, again, that's holistic. That's not only food, right? We move less. Our air is polluted, especially if you live in a city. So much pollution you're breathing in all the time. And the way we just live, this normal as we create it. I'll do another video on the myth of normal by Gabor Mate, which I talked about in this recent podcast. A little bit, but we don't look at everything when we do have to. And it makes sense. It totally warrants, like, no one has the time. You're busy. You're busy working. You're busy making sure you have food on the table. You're busy making sure that your family is okay. You're busy making sure your kids go to school and get educated or doing the right things. You're busy, and that's okay. But we, as a society currently, must not just take facts, I'm putting that in quotations, at face value. We need to question it, which is part of this podcast, right? The Ponder podcast. Anyway, moving on. Take women who leave Harvard as an example. With a professional postgraduate degree, arguably members of the most elite educational group in the world. 15 years after graduating, only half of these women are working full-time. What happened? The time bind happened. Children require time. Careers require time. At the University of Chicago MBA study, women earn about 12% less than their male classmates, a gap largely explained by the kind of jobs chosen. 13 years later, the difference had widened dramatically to about 38%. But one subgroup of the female MBAs had not fallen further behind. By now, you may already know who those ones are, the ones without children. For most women, having a child is an economic equivalent of being hit by a meteorite. And for most men, it barely makes a dent. So if you want to be strong, in charge, and make a lot of money, which I always say, you need to look at your values and what you truly want in your life before making those decisions, because you can't have it all. And this has been proven through evolution, biology. And it's really difficult to argue with biology and what the world and nature create, because everything works in unison, everything works in its benefit. And although there are really rarely any errors, even within those errors that nature makes, it soon fixes it, right? And this is a huge one because most women probably want kids. Maybe there's a few that don't. Those are outliers. But most people want kids. They want to continue their gender. I mean, if you look at philosophy, like one of the pieces of philosophy that I've read a long time ago was that our sole purpose of being here is to procreate and continue our gene line. That's what we want to do. Like when you break everything away and you remove everything in our core, that's what we want to do. So, and you can think of it differently. You know, I know Tom Bilyeu and his wife Lisa, very successful, have a successful podcast, Impact Theory. Tom Bilyeu sold Quest Nutrition for like $1 billion or something like that. They don't want kids, but the way they view it is that their kids are the people they teach, right? So they have somewhere that they're putting that energy towards. So something to think about as you think of these things and look at the numbers and why women make more than men. That's one part of the pie, as he said, just roughly 1/3. But it warrants, that's 33% of the issue. That's a pretty big number. So from there, there's a lot of pieces there, we'll go into the part where he talks about dads and how fathers have lost their traditional role in the family. A man who knows he must provide for a wife and children has a clear sense of how to be purposeful and whole. For at least the last few thousand years, men could essentially describe their role in 4 words: providing for my family. Important. Rather than looking in the rearview mirror, we need to establish a new basis for fatherhood, one that embraces the huge progress we have made towards gender equality. Wifeless men, by contrast, are often a mess. Compared to married men, their health is worse, their employment rates are lower, and their social networks are weaker. Drug-related deaths among never-married men more than doubled in the decade from 2010. Divorce, now twice as likely to be initiated by wives as husbands, is psychologically harder on men than women. One of the great revelations of feminism may turn out to be that men need women more than women need men. Wives were economically dependent on their husbands, but men were emotionally dependent on their wives. For all of their jokes about the ball and chain, many men seem to know this. In the 2016 poll, more men than women ranked being married either now or in the future as very important to me. 58 versus 47%, so more men. Men do not want to be ships without sails. And I was listening to a podcast the other day, and something they mentioned in the podcast, I believe it was Scott Galloway on the podcast, they talked about men and the rise of lonely and single men and the destruction that can possibly cause, because the number keeps going up, and obviously I remember hearing a comedian say a joke. It was like, if you have 100 people in a room, what makes you think that one of those won't be a fucking idiot? All right. But in this case, it's like, out of 100 lonely single men, which one of those don't you think who may become a mass shooter in a school because they don't have anything to live for, and they want to get revenge on society in some shape or form, right? A young, lonely man is dangerous, and not the good kind of dangerous, the really bad kind of dangerous. Men need leadership. Men need guidance. This is why, and this chapter being on fathers, why fathers are so fucking important, right? And we've created politically and socially through our systems, we've created a place where men are feel like the stack is against them. When you think about divorce, right? It mostly impacts a man, right? When he gets divorced, not only psychologically and emotionally, financially, mostly, right? Which is why the whole Johnny Depp situation that happened a few months ago was such a big deal, because that was the first time you ever seen a man win a court case when normally a woman would, and where you see justice actually take do the right thing based on everything, based on the evidence, based on the stories told, everything like that. It wasn't even a money thing. Like, he literally was like, I'm gonna showcase the whole thing so people can see I'm not bullshitting. And he's not a perfect man. He has his own pains and darkness, but and it's unfortunate for, I think her name is Amber, to go through that, but she put herself in that situation, right? And thought that the world was utilizing her standing as a woman in this current world as a way to be like, oh, if it showcases, fine, everyone's going to be on the woman's side because everyone's always on the woman's side, right? Men have had control for far too long, but the joke was on her at the end of the day, right? And it's rare. It rarely happens. Men are more likely to be the abusers, more likely to be the reason why a relationship gets out. I always say it takes two anyway. Like, both people have to hold themselves responsible. And he totally didn't do the right things. I didn't follow it to a T, but I used to watch like summaries because I don't have time, just like yourself, to listen to the whole thing. And that was like hours upon hours. And there was some great people who did that, and then they provided summaries on YouTube. So there's that. But anyway, I digress because I don't know anything. I'm always just pondering and thinking through things. So then we move to the class ceiling. Poor boys and men are suffering. Did you know that men account for almost 70% of the opioid overdose deaths in the U.S.? In a study of suicides, Australian researcher Fiona Shand and her colleagues looked at the words or phrases that men who have attempted suicide most often use to describe themselves. At the top of the list were, can you guess? I'm asking you, listener. Let's say, take a moment and guess real quick. What were those two words to describe themselves, these folks who wanted to commit suicide or attempted suicide? I'll give you a second. If you guessed useless and worthless, ding ding, you're correct. The true cause of male malaise, I believe, is not a lack of labor force participation, but cultural redundancy. Men need purpose. I talked about this. King, warrior, magician, lover. The way of the superior man. Go watch those videos. Purpose is everything to a man. We need purpose. We need something to work for. And unfortunately, this affects most folks at the bottom of the totem pole. The poor, because equality is always easier for the affluent, which is a quote from the book. It's really unfortunate. Anyway, quote from Raj Chetty. Gender gaps in adulthood have roots in childhood. And Raj Chetty and his co-authors conducted a U.S. study on this. Perhaps because poverty and exposure to disadvantaged neighborhoods during childhood are particularly harmful for boys. So let's talk about these boys in these places. And I can say I'm from one of those places. Coney Island, Brooklyn is a very poor neighborhood. Probably becoming better this day and age, but that's where I grew up before New York became, Brooklyn at least, became the spot to be. So in high school, boys' academic performance is much more affected by family backgrounds, measured in terms of income, parental education, and marriage, than girls. The bigger impact of class position on boys and men is also clear in post-secondary education. Girls raised in the poorest families, i.e., the bottom fifth of the distribution, are 57% more likely to get a 4-year college degree than boys from similar background, compared to a difference of just 8% among those from the affluent, the top fifth distribution of families. Boys suffer more from family instability, especially from the exit of biological fathers. Boys raised by single parents, especially single mothers, have worse outcomes than girls, including their own sisters at school, and lower rates of college enrollment, in part because of the bigger differences in behavioral problems in the classroom. And when I was reading this book, just to give you some insight, like, I had to put it down several times because I just got emotional. Because, like, I'm one of these boys. Like, literally, like, I almost dropped out in high school. I had a horrible freshman year of high school. There were a lot of things going on in my life in terms of family that affected me to the point that I never went to class. I used to just cut with, like, I hung out with just the wrong crowd who always wanted to cut and have these, you know, go outside, chill outside all day, go to hooky. We used to call those hooky parties. I don't know if those things still exist, but where people just throw a party in the middle of the workday because their parents aren't home. They just invite people. They get alcohol. They're able to find somebody who's 21 and older. They have a brother and sister who's 21 and older that, for some reason, supports them in this. And I grew up in a single family household. And I definitely, my grades didn't show. My grades were mostly C's until I hit my junior year of high school, where I decided to pick myself up. And don't ask me what made me make that decision. It just kind of happened. I don't know. I must have had the universe, God, some angel, I don't know, that to tell me, like, don't go this route. This is not your path. Because most boys don't get as lucky as I did when it came to me fully understanding, like, shit, like, I'm doing something really wrong at that age, especially. Anyway, moving forward. This research team noted that the case managers assigned to do work with students, called navigators, were all women. When a program relies heavily on a close one-to-one relationship, matching gender of the provider and recipient may be important. This is consistent with research showing that when the racial or gender identities of teachers and learners or mentors and mentees match, results often get better. Crucial. Remember that. Remember, if you need guidance as a young boy, I'm going to use boys for instance, since that's the topic of the book, you need more male educators. You need more male guidance counselors. We need more men in these jobs, because through that, we'll support other men. And as much as ladies, I know you want to help men, there's a lot of women out there that really want to help young boys. And at the end of the day, they'll listen or not listen. They'll act like they're listening and still do whatever they want to do. They need a masculine force to come in and support them through that. Because I wish I had that, and I did for a little bit. I had a dean, Mr. Felix, in high school, and he, even though I rarely saw him, I joined the anime club, which he kind of like led. Obviously, there was a president and a vice president, but you know, that was helpful for me during my sophomore to senior year to be a part of. And you know, the fact that he loved video games and we were able to connect deeply on that was important to me. And it made me look forward to seeing him in the hallway, and he always held me accountable if I did something bad, or he saw me in the hallway cutting class, or whatever the case may be. I respected him a lot, you know? So then while the author, going back to the book, was researching this book, he did come across, he went to school to talk to young men, and he specifically talked to one that he put notes in. So this young man named Tyrese, a young black man in Kalamazoo, expressed 4 big differences between the boys and girls. First, motivation. Second, independence. Third, persistence. Fourth, planning. Let me break it down. For motivation, women are more driven at a younger age. When they, like men aren't as driven because they need guidance. Second, independence. Women don't really need a relationship because they're more likely to do things on their own. Men become enamored by women, and that's all they care about, right? We don't think with the head, we think with the other one. Third, persistence. When things get hard, girls usually run to the problem. At least this is this boy's experience, right? They usually run to a problem, while guys tend to run away from the problem. Fourth, planning. Women tend to live in the future and think about their future much more than men. But women do better in school because of these 4. At least that was the belief. And the author agreed with this, So we're going into part 3, which is biology and culture. And I knew this podcast was going to be long. I'm thinking it's probably going to be close to an hour. But, when it comes to biology, just thinking, and there's a lot of notes here, but overall, biology does a lot. Men grow up, in our brain is flushed with testosterone, and testosterone much more than most women. There's always outliers. There are women during the process of being in the womb do get flushed with a lot of testosterone and become more quote unquote manly than the typical woman or female. So going through this, he talks about the brain volume, how the brain matures and develops. And we know that, I'm pretty sure you know this, you've probably heard it, that women's brains develop much faster than men. And that's magnified or muted by culture, right? So he says here, I'm pretty sure that if I would be more physically aggressive if I had been born in Sparta versus now, there's no need to be physically aggressive. So culture and biology do not develop separately from each other. They co-evolve. Always remember that, right? And, the relationship between testosterone, masculinity, and aggression trigger aggression, but amplifies. Men have a greater appetite for risk. This is due to the fact that we do have more testosterone, so we're willing to take risk. It's not a social construct. This is based around biology. It can be identified in every known society throughout history. As Joyce Bennison shows in her book, Warriors and Warriors, The Survival of the Sexes. Sex difference, says, exists in virtually every area in which risk has been studied. With males engaging in more risk taking than females, writes a team of scholars studying leadership styles. Similar findings have been reported from hunter-gatherers to bank CEOs. Like aggression, risk-taking is one of the difference between male and female psychology that has clear roots in our evolutionary history. Taking risks must then make more sense for men. But why? Bluntly, because men are much less likely than women to reproduce at all. In fact, we have twice as many female ancestors as male ones. This can take a minute to get your head around. After all, genetically speaking, everyone must have a mother and father. But of course, one man can father many children with many women, while others father none at all. This is exactly what has happened historically. And that's crazy. Think about it. Dating apps. I mean, the top, 1% of men, you talk about attractive, they make money, and do cool shit. So they have a social aspect as well. They get all the likes and attractive women. So they hold on to that versus the bottom of the totem pole, they get any. And think, there's a great podcast with a data scientist who talks about this on Chris Williamson's podcast, Modern Wisdom. I totally forgot the podcast, but he talks about the data behind, it's a woman, sorry. She talks about the data. I think she's like a data scientist for one of the big dating apps like Bumble or something. And then obviously, for a young boy growing up in a stressful and stable family environment, this appears to influence the capacity of the brain to metabolize serotonin, which helps reduce aggressive behaviors. And they did studies on life trajectories of identical twins influence how far genes associated with risk-taking are dampened or amplified. Children with fathers in prison see a shortening of the length of their telomeres, the end of the chromosomes, which means less life, which increases the risk of health problems in adulthood. Boys with genes that make them more sensitive to their environment do worse when their biological father leaves the household, but also benefit most if their biological father joins the household. An example of how being an orchid can bring benefits as well as its costs. Manhood, I love this line right here. Manhood is continuous achievement rather than just a single milestone. In many cultures, rites of initiation, often involving physical duress of risk, have marked the transition from boy to man. As the American poet Leonard Kriegel wrote, quote, in every age, not just our own, manhood has something that had to be won. We always have to be evolving. Evolution is such a big part of being a man and being a woman, right? Like, a woman jumps through hoops. You have a period, you become a mother. Like, those are really, really big moments in a woman's life. In a man, our big thing is getting the flush of testosterone when we're kids and our balls dropping. After that, I mean, maybe when we have a kid, is it the same for every man? I don't know. I'd be curious to hear if you're a father in the comment section. But yeah, like, men don't have that. So we have to actually have a rite of initiation into manhood. And that needs to happen again and again over the course of our lives. Quote, real men do not simply emerge naturally over time like butterflies from boyish cocoons. They must be assiduously coaxed from their juvenescent shells, shaped and nurtured, counseled and proved into manhood. This is not to suggest that there is a single blueprint for making men. To say that men have to be made does not mean there is only one set of instructions. What makes for a quote-unquote real man varies greatly across cultures. There's no one way. Every culture does it differently, but it does play a huge role towards channeling that energy of men towards positive social ends, right? Like, you need to teach a man that caring for others is important, right? And a lot of cultures see that as fragile, weak. And that's unfortunate, right? Because we have this idea of masculinity being, you need to be the tough guy all the time, when you don't. Like, being vulnerable is just as powerful. Then the last part of the book, I'm not going to read anymore because I know we're running on time and this has gone on long. If you're still listening, thank you so much. You're an amazing person. Some of the things I like that he posted was redshirting, and this is where you start boys in school a year later than women, because of the fact that we talked about earlier, women's brains grow much faster. So giving boys an additional year can be so helpful. And he shows a little bit of the data in the book. I'm not going to go over that because of time, but as I mentioned before, he does talk about, like, we need more men in front of the classroom based on, like, who we listen to as young people. If you're a girl, you love to watch other women who are kicking ass in the game, and as a young boy, you want to see the same. And we want to see more vulnerable, respectable, wonderful women doing wonderful things to talk to these young men. Right? He talks about bringing more men into K-12 teaching, because obviously they take a lot. More men are professors, which I had a question on that because he didn't really dig into that. And it's like, why more men become professors than women? Because I think it's almost half and half, but more male representation in most colleges versus in K-12 education, it's a lot. It's a ridiculous amount of women. I think it's like 24% right now, and that's down from the 80s where it was 33%, so almost 10% less. Less men are going into education. One thing he does mention here is career and technical education, so CTE schools, where mostly Hispanic and Black folks go to. That's interesting because my father himself is a contractor, which is a lot of these schools. They go into contracting and things like that. But they make more money than their, folks equivalent if they follow and they just get a high school diploma. So we need more of that as well. Then he talks about getting more men into those heel jobs he talked about: health, education, administration, and I think it's linguistics. Because there's not a lot of men in those jobs. I think it's like 15% he has here. So he says, I'll read this quote: getting more men into heel jobs is to help meet the growing demand for labor in occupations like nursing and teaching. Almost half of all registered nurses are now over the age of 50. I think it's beautiful to bring more men into those jobs and remove all those gender stereotypes for jobs, because I've seen a lot of men that care for others, who can be great nurses, great teachers, right? Then just to close out on some things, Anna Manchin wrote a book called The Life of Dad, and she observed that while fathers and mothers can do many things the same, dads are wired to make two distinct contributions: protection and teaching. Of course, their expression will vary by social context. To protect your child means something very different in the 21st century New York than on the savannah 500,000 years ago. And fathers have an especially important role to play in the period of adolescence, in those early versus the early years, when nurturing and attachment are key, which is very strongly represented by women. Adolescence is a time when children are finding their own feet, testing boundaries, and starting to go their own way, where fathers play a pivotal role in guiding them. And, as we move into this new world where men are requiring purpose, because purpose is slowly being dragged away because of automation and all these other unfortunate circumstances, we can play as men a more fulfilling role, and have closer relationships with our children, right? Most men don't see it that way. They need to work and they need to be the breadwinner. Not necessarily, now that we both have to work, and it's been wonderful to have women in the workforce because it's helped us grow as a society. But as with everything, nothing is perfect, right? Nothing is perfect, and everything we do does have consequences. We just have to choose which consequences we're willing to tolerate. Evolution does this. When we became humans, I think I told the story before, so apologize if you've heard it. I'll just be brief. To be human and to stand on 2 feet like we do now, we had to lose the ability to run faster. If you look at a gorilla or any, animal that uses all 4, and a gorilla can stand on 2, but not for long, we had to sacrifice that motion to run really fast. If you look at any animal on 4 and how they run, I run with my dog and he pretty much kicks my ass every time. We got 2 feet. We're able to run endurance longer than most four-legged creatures, but they will beat us immediately If we start running, they're going to catch us in no time, which is, in the savannah back in the day, that wasn't really useful. What was useful is the fact that we were able to use 2 feet to carry things, right? So we gave up something. We gave up that initial speed for the long-term benefit of endurance and being able to carry things on our back. But everything has, you have this, you're going to sacrifice this. While we can do our best to find equality, he talks about it in the book, and the example I would use is, he says, in STEM jobs, we'll never see 50-50, because do a lot of women want to do this? I mean, I'd be interested in the comments below if you're a woman listening, as opposed to, like, would you want to do a STEM job? Or is your calling something else? And men, is your calling one of those heel jobs we talked about? Is maybe that? I'd be curious to hear. Or do you not care, right? Like, there's that too. Like, whichever comes first. But obviously STEM jobs at the moment pay more than a heel job. So how important is money to you, right? It's important to all of us to make a living and to live relatively comfortable. But do we need millions? Not really. Not a lot of people do. And if they do, they're probably very depressed that they have all that money, you know, because it's hard to make friends when you make a lot of money. And connections, because you probably feel everyone's against you. Who knows? But anyway, I digress. This is getting longer than I hoped, but this was such a wonderful book of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It by Richard Reeves. Thank you if you're still here for listening. I hope you enjoyed this. Please like, comment, subscribe, follow us on Spotify and iTunes. Leave a 5-star review if you truly enjoyed this and you listen to some of our other stuff. But I appreciate you being here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'm happy to bring more of these reviews and summaries to you as I continue this podcast journey. All right. Well, I'm out. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Peace.